Welcome back to another episode of Gimme Some Truth. Today, Evan, Polly, and myself are going to talk about gifting to family members, an area that can be very generous, very thoughtful, but also fraught with areas of concern. So we're going to help uncover a couple of those today and help you make the right choice for your family. But first off, Evan is a newly minted CFP.
Yay. That's right.
Evan, what was the hardest part about the process?
Oh gosh, I think it's the mental aspect of trying to stay committed and focused and force yourself to study for 2, 3, 4 hours every night, for 2 or 3 months. That was a lot, especially there were nights when my wife Lauren was out with friends or going to dinner or doing fun things, and I'm stuck at home in our little office in the back corner of our house with one lamp on. You can just picture a very sad Evan, head poured over the desk. Yeah.
For people that don't know, it's an incredibly difficult process just in general. The exam is incredibly challenging as well. How long was the start to finish process for you?
I had to do some background work in terms of some educational components that I had to complete. So I did that over the course of probably 1.5 years, but I took that part kind of slow. But then in terms of the actual hardcore nose to the grindstone studying, over the course of 3 months or so of daily studying, and then the month leading up to the exam was every day, just intense. Hours at a time. I took a lot of time, generous time from work in the afternoons to go home and study basically all afternoon and all night for about a month.
You did it.
So
you don't have to do it again.
Don't have to do it ever again.
Yay. Congratulations.
Good job, Evan.
Polly, big event in the Price household last night. What happened?
Yeah, I was telling Nate before this that my 5-year-old daughter yesterday lost her very first tooth, which is really exciting. But then when we got home, she also found her very first tick on her, and right before bedtime. So bedtime was delayed a little bit. Had to settle her down.
Some fireworks.
She was a little freaked out. The irony is that she's in 4K and they do like units every week or every few weeks, and they just started the bug unit yesterday. So she knew all about ticks and how they are blood-sucking insects, and so we had to, calm
have a
down.
Conversation.
Crisis averted.
This is a financial podcast. Yes. Inflation adjusted. What does the Tooth Fairy now provide to little ones in regard to the first tooth?
We had a conversation about this yesterday too in the office. The Tooth Fairy provided $5
that's the going rate?
my daughter's very first tooth.
Was that by design, or that's what we had on hand?
That's what we had on hand. Okay. I was more in the quarter to $1 range, but I think first tooth we decided, the Tooth Fairy decided that moving forward, the first tooth you get more money.
There you go.
After that.
Set the precedent.
We'll see. Mm-hmm. Yeah, we'll see.
A fantastic form of gifting.
It is. Yeah.
Again, gifting for us, we have these conversations all the time with clients, and it always warms our heart when we hear people that want to do this. But let's talk about a couple of the ways that we make this work for everybody. First of all, Polly, what assets can we gift typically?
Yeah. Typically, the asset that you see most commonly, I guess, would be cash, right? I think when, and to back up a little bit, for this conversation today, I think our goal was to kind of talk about giving during your lifetime. So while you're still alive, right, you want to gift to your kids, you want to see them use your gift to go on vacation, to, maybe use it for something that they actually need to fund their lives with. So typically that is going to come in the form of cash, because you think of okay, my kid needs money to help pay for a new car, something like that. Let me give them the money to do it, rather than let me give them, some property that they can sell, turn around and sell. So typically we're talking about cash, and that's usually the easiest form of gifting. But you can definitely gift, like I said, property. You can give jewelry, furniture, stuff like that, even real estate. But then you can also give stock, right? You can give stocks and any, other type of security, although that has different implications, which we can get into. But I think for, the most part, cash is the number one thing that we tend to see clients give their kids.
Yeah. Everybody hear a lot about gifting amounts every year. What's the limit this year? Can you talk just briefly about that? I think there's some kind of confusion or misunderstanding in terms of how those limits apply.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think a lot of people are concerned about the tax implications when they gift money to family or their kids or whoever it may be. And it's important to understand that for most Americans, there aren't really going to be any tax implications, no matter how much they give. There's an asterisk next to that, of course, but for 2026, the annual gift tax exclusion for each person is $19,000, meaning that if I had kids, which I don't, but if I had kids, fast forward 30 years, I had adult kids, I could gift each kid $19,000 myself and not have to worry about any tax implications. Now, if I decided to gift them more than $19,000, maybe $30,000, that would require a little bit more logistics. You have to file what's called Form 709, which is a gift tax return.
Yep.
But that doesn't necessarily mean any taxes due at that point. And we can get into the details of that, later on in the podcast. Yep. But the important part is high level for most Americans. Gifting cash to kids, other family members, friends, whoever it may be, isn't going to come with any actual tax due.
Yeah, I think the confusion comes in, correct me if I'm wrong, that it affects your lifetime gifting amount, right, by filing the IRS form, but it does not mean, in your example, the additional $11,000, 30 minus 19, the additional $11,000 is not taxable in that year. It simply reduces your lifetime exemption, of which most people won't hit anyways.
Right. Yeah, in 2026, the individual lifetime gift exemption is $15 million, and for married couples, it's $30 million.
Sure.
So a vast majority of Americans, like I said, aren't going to have to worry about hitting that limit at any point in their lifetimes. And if you do, well, then that's where a lot more detailed planning has to come into play, and those are different conversations that you have to have.
Absolutely. Polly, talk a little bit about if people do want to donate stock, securities, things like that. How does that work logistically? Kind of what are the issues that we run into when we see people wanting to do that?
Yeah, I mean, there's two parts to that. The logistical part of it is if you wanted to give someone a stock, you can literally just transfer it, right?
Yep.
It's called in-kind transfer. You pick up a stock right from your account and you put it into your kid's account or wherever. And so then now they have ownership over it. The problem with doing that during your lifetime is, and I don't say problem, it might not behoove you to do that during your lifetime and or your kids especially, because they don't get what's called a step up in basis once they assume ownership of the stock, right? So let's say you purchase a stock for $10,000 10 or so years ago. Now your kid is in need of some money for, whoever knows where, whatever reason. Now that stock is worth $20,000. Well, if you give that stock to your kid during your lifetime, they're going to assume your original cost basis, so $10,000, right? So if they turn around and sell that stock because they need the cash, well, then they're on the hook for $10,000 of, long-term capital gains. However, this is kind of more morose topic, right? But like if you had waited until you passed away and then gift, your kid was the beneficiary on your account, they get what's called a step up in cost basis. And so they get to assume the cost basis of that stock on the day that you passed away, right? So it would be $20,000, let's say, and then your kid turns around and sells that stock. Well, then there's no capital gains to be realized. So it's a lot more tax efficient.
Yeah, and so the idea is timing, right? If it's really, really important in this example for somebody to have their kids or whoever it might be have those shares while they're still alive, they can do that, but they are not benefiting from this very, very generous tax law that's in place right now of step up in basis.
Yeah.
And that's not just stocks, that's real estate and other items as well. And we see people kind of trip up on this, especially late in life where people just kind of want to take their estate down as far as they can. And boy, they'd really get themselves into a spot where they could have saved a lot of money if they had done that. Yeah.
And especially passing that on to your kid, right? If you really want to have, give them the benefit of that money, then not having it taxed as heavily is also part of that gift, right?
Yeah. And maybe there's other ways to get it done, right? Maybe we can give cash instead of stock. Maybe we can, there's other ways that we can potentially look to do that. And so I think that's where, again, working with a professional is really, really helpful to make sure that we're getting the benefit, all of the benefit of that generous decision to do that. Evan, can you talk a little bit in terms of why communication is so important within, say, families and things like that in terms of giving money? You're lucky to have somebody gift you money, or you, as you said, later in your life, you give people money. what happens the next time, or what is the cadence of that? I mean, you help to people to understand, because I don't think people really understand the impact of, I did this generous thing, but yet it also now has confused people moving forward in terms of, will there be more? How does this work? That kind of thing.
Yeah, I think an open communication with whoever you're gifting the assets to is really important. And in most cases, at least with our clients, it's, parents to kids.
Sure.
And like you said, the parents are doing a very generous thing by gifting, cash to their kids, whether it's a one-time gift, it's an annual gift, it's, birthday money every year, whatever it may be. But if it's going to be of a larger amount or more significant amount of money every year, or whatever the cadence is, having conversations with the recipients of those gifts are really important, because that can help clarify any confusion of, will there be more gifts in the future? Can I rely on this, $10,000 gift every year to help, pay for my kids' preschool or whatever it may be? Especially for a lot of people, a significant gift like that makes a big difference in their day-to-day lives, especially if it's for living expenses. Or if you have multiple kids, right? Are you gifting the same amount to each kid?
Yep.
If not, why is that? And if the kids find out that you're not gifting the same amounts, is there going to be, some animosity there?
Yeah.
So having as much open communication with expectations with the recipients is really important, just to make sure you don't get yourself into a tough spot down the road.
Yeah, and I think the first question that we ask in those situations, if we're dealing with the people getting the gift, is, do you think you will get this again? Mm-hmm. And a lot of times they don't know. And so then therefore the planning that we can do for the people getting the gifts is also challenging, because we don't know whether we can rely on that for maybe the Roth IRA contribution every year or whatever it might be. So that creates problems in that way.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Holly, how about when grandparents want to give money to kids, say kids in their teens? That can have an effect on college and college funding. Will I get money from the FAFSA form? Mm-hmm. If all of a sudden, junior now has $20,000 in their brokerage account and they're 15 years old.
Yeah, that's a good point. And yeah, if they have that money, it's they're gonna assume ownership of it, right, at a certain point. So that is something to consider, the implications on FAFSA and student aid that they'll get. But that is another option of gifting, right? Like, we do want to consider that if you don't want to give straight cash to someone, especially if they're a younger or they're an adolescent, what are the options for what type of accounts can you kind of retain ownership over the funds and, see to their growth and everything. And then once the beneficiary gets to be a certain age or a certain life event, like going to college, something like that, then they can, use the funds for what they need at that point in time. So we see a lot of clients use custodial accounts for something like that. Yep. And custodial accounts are fine, right? Like you have the account owner, so the parent or the grandparent in this scenario they're the account owner, so they manage the funds up until the beneficiary, the child, right, assumes the age of majority, which is usually like 18 to 21 years old.
Depending on the state. And there's other nuances to that as well. But yes, depending on what's, on the actual account. And then once that account or once that age hits, those assets are in the kids in the beneficiary's name, right? So they could turn around and rip everything out of that account if it's in a custodial account. Yeah.
529s are a little bit different, right? The beneficiary is always the beneficiary. The account owner remains the account owner. And so you can still designate where you want, the account owner can designate where they want those funds to go. It doesn't the beneficiary doesn't assume ownership over it.
But I think that's a great point, because control is really, really important. And I think people don't quite understand how that control piece works. We hear this a lot of people saying, I want to give money to my kids, but I don't necessarily want them to be able to kind of use it for whatever they want.
Right.
And you go, well, hold on a second.
Yeah.
You drop that in a custodial account.
Yeah. And direct giving, which is kind of what we're talking about, like giving cash, direct gifts in terms of stocks, stock transfers. That's what you're kind of doing, right? There's a whole other side to giving, which, you could talk about special exception strategies and, giving within a trust vehicle, right? Yep, that's a whole other topic. But if you're talking about just giving direct gifts, back to what Evan was talking about, it's really worth the conversation with the beneficiary, with your kids, whoever, because I don't think most people are out there like writing up contracts with their, 25-year-old kids
Right.
to say like, okay, we're going to give you 20 grand this year, but you are only supposed to use it for this amount. And if you don't, we're going to sue you.
Right.
I've never seen that
Right.
in our, in this environment. But, but just knowing that like you are relinquishing control. Once the money is transferred, once the stock is transferred, you are relinquishing control. And so,
there can't be strings attached.
Yeah.
And I think that's, there, as you said, there's ways to do what most people want to do within reason, but if you do it on your own and you do it incorrectly, then you don't have that protection that you potentially want.
Right.
Yeah. Evan, just kind of in wrapping up here, what are your recommendations in terms of, hey, I want to do this. What's the first thing that I should do? I'm a grandparent. I'm a parent. I want to do this. I've got desire to make this happen. And it's not just $500. Not that that's a small amount of money, but I want to gift $20,000. What's the first thing that person should do?
Yeah, I mean, if you work with a financial advisor, I would say the first step would be go to them.
Yes.
Just to understand what impact this may have on your overall financial plan, especially if you are a grandparent and you're in your retirement years. Maybe you're on a fixed income or you're drawing down your retirement accounts. Larger gifts like that can have a big impact on your overall financial plan, especially if they're recurring. You're giving out those gifts to multiple grandchildren, for example. So meeting with your financial advisor, if you have one, would be step one, I think.
Yeah.
And then after that, I think reiterating what we've said multiple times is communicate with the recipient. Once you have a set amount, once you're comfortable with in your head what the cadence of these gifts might be and the amounts, having those open conversations with the recipients just to make sure expectations are set and that everybody knows kind of what to expect going forward.
Yeah. Probably pitfalls, kind of just 2 or 3 pitfalls you see most often that people make when it comes to gifting.
Yeah. Well, I think like on the other side of that too is obviously we're preaching like open communication. That's obviously not always going to be possible because we're talking about family dynamics here, and those are so convoluted and tricky, especially if there's like multiple kids involved. And, so we're not going to tell clients like, no, you can't do something because it's not equitable amongst your children or it's not the most like tax efficient way, right? Ultimately, it's their decision. But I think that is kind of one of the pitfalls is that maybe people get caught up in like am I doing this the best way possible? Am I doing this the most tax efficient way possible? I'm going to be taxed at, if I give this gift, it's going to affect my, my taxes this year. And like Evan said, for most people, that's just not true. And for most Americans, it's relatively simple. There's not a lot of administrative work that has to go into it. If you're just giving money to your kids to, help them get by or whatever. Yeah. So I think maybe thinking about it too much and maybe just the inaction part that can cause is probably one of the biggest pitfalls.
Yeah, I'll touch on one myself that we see sometimes as advisors, and that's when it kind of almost goes the other way, where you have kids asking for money from the parents or asking for money, and you just have to be so careful because, to your point, the emotion that gets involved with it and the subjective aspect of it really lean on us as advisors because you have the best intentions by doing something like that, but boy, that can create a dynamic that's really unhealthy in the family and can actually lead to a place we've seen it turn into situations that can get really tricky to try to navigate. And in most cases, it's not the first one; it's the second, third, fourth one where it really starts to get tricky. Let's end on a positive note. Evan, best gift you ever got?
So you said you were going to ask us a question that we didn't know the answer to.
Right.
This is going to be that one.
Maybe I have another one.
I would say, okay, I can lump them together because I played baseball growing up.
Okay.
I was obsessed with baseball from the time I was like 4 all the way through high school.
Which is weird because you played volleyball in high school.
I did, yeah. Eventually that kind of switched over. But for most of my childhood, it was baseball. So there were a few Christmases when I got new baseball bats. And at that time, when you're like 12, 13 years old and you get the new fancy bat that you have been looking at for months, that's like literally waking up on Christmas morning and just opening up your big gift. It was awesome.
Polly?
So mine will probably come into surprise to you guys, but I was once gifted a vacuum from my mother-in-law. This is years ago when like Dyson vacuums were pretty brand new.
Sure.
And I was joked about how much I wanted one, and my boyfriend at the time, now husband, were like, we made no money.
Yeah,
We were in our early 20s and just moved in together. And my mother-in-law gifted me on Christmas a brand new Dyson vacuum, and I cried. I was so happy. It's like, awesome. I was also like meaningful. Like it was a very sweet gift from her. Like she knew it would. But it sounds silly saying it out loud now. So judge myself.
if it means something to you, then it's great, right?
Yeah.
Again, we're always advocates of people calling us and asking us questions. We like to say if your question involves a $, we can likely help you. In this area, we really, really emphasize contact us. It's just something you want to make sure that you do correctly and that you get the impact out that you're looking for, and that it actually is done in a way that makes the most financial sense. So we can take something that is very, very subjective and has a lot of emotion, but we can handle the objective finance side of it and make sure that box gets checked as well, which is really important. So thanks so much for tuning in to another episode of Gimme Some Truth.
Walkner Condon Financial Advisors is a registered investment advisor with the SEC. Registration with the SEC does not imply a certain level of skill or training. The opinions expressed by the participants of this podcast are their own and do not reflect the opinions of Walkner Condon Financial Advisors. All statements and opinions expressed are based upon information considered reliable, although it should not be relied upon as such. Any statements or opinions are subject to change without notice. Information presented is for educational purposes only and does not intend to make an offer or solicitation for the sale or purchase of any specific securities, investments, or investment strategies. Investments involve risk and, unless otherwise stated, are not guaranteed. Information expressed does not take into account your specific situation or objectives and is not intended as recommendations appropriate for any individual. Listeners are encouraged to seek advice from a qualified tax, legal, or investment advisor to determine whether any information presented may be suitable for their specific situation. Past performance is not indicative of future performance. Thanks for listening, and for further information, please visit WalknerCondon.com.